Hey everybody, I'm DRSI. Thank you for joining me on InfoPedia for another video. Now today we're going to be looking at Bitcoin. How has Bitcoin performed during this crisis, the pandemic COVID-19? How has it fared against the dollar, against other stocks? More after this. Some experts have argued that Bitcoin is potentially a robust defensive asset, somewhat like gold. And this is Bitcoin's first major US recession, when these sorts of assets can do well. So how is it doing? So far, the performance of Bitcoin has been mixed because Bitcoin has held up better than many stocks but has fared less well than many other assets that can protect portfolios at times of market stress. For the year to date, Bitcoin has fallen 5%. Now that is much better than the S&P 500, which is off 14% for the year. Nevertheless, other assets that can offer safe haven at a time of crisis have risen. For example, gold is up at about 11% and a diversified portfolio of bonds is up 4%. Hence, if you view Bitcoin as a sophisticated digital form of gold, it hasn't quite played out that way during this crisis so far. However, we should also note that we may still be very early in seeing the full economic impact of COVID-19, and as such, it is hard for us to reach a conclusive verdict until the economic impact has played out in full. Ideally, you'd want to look across multiple economic cycles. Though Bitcoin is a relatively young asset, this is not possible. So how about the long-term performance of Bitcoin? Though on a near-term view, Bitcoin hasn't done what many other safe haven assets have done. It is of course noteworthy that on a 5-year view, Bitcoin's return still dwarfs just about any other major asset class because Bitcoin has risen over 30-fold over that same period. So the question is Bitcoin a safe haven? It doesn't appear that Bitcoin behaves as a safe haven asset at this point. Whereas high quality bonds and gold have risen over the crisis, Bitcoin has not risen. Still, it is also somewhat early for us to reach that determination. And you could also imagine that Bitcoin has outperformed stocks by a substantial margin and potentially remains a less correlated asset. That still means that it can potentially play a role in portfolios. That is to say, even though Bitcoin may not necessarily rise in times of crises, it follows its own supply and demand drivers, and that can be useful in managing any type of risk. A similar example might be other commodities such as oil. In this crisis, oil has had a massive decline as a price war has occurred in conjunction with the COVID-19 outbreak. But at other times of crisis, oil has performed very well. So holding lots of different assets from stocks to Bitcoin to oil in portfolios can potentially smooth returns over time compared to holding individual assets in isolation. And you may realize that the term isolation has become a mainstay on people's lips the past couple of months. Talking about Bitcoin, what has been the role of the dollar? So if you look at one role of Bitcoin, it is to potentially protect against the falling value of currencies such as the US dollar. We call these fiat currency. Interestingly, so far for this crisis, the US dollar has risen quite strongly on a trade-weighted basis and is up at around 8% for the year so far. Now that creates a headwind for Bitcoin when you are assessing its price in dollars. Indeed, though a future crisis may involve a weakening dollar, and that may bode well for Bitcoin, this crisis has definitely not played out that way so far. So we can say that so far in this recession, Bitcoin hasn't quite behaved as a safe haven asset, and there are probably better strategies to protect your portfolio. However, it must be noted that Bitcoin can still diversify portfolios to some degree, and that makes it potentially very useful. Plus, it's still very early to assess the performance of Bitcoin during this crisis. For other major asset classes, we have over a century of data across many economic scenarios. However, for Bitcoin, we have had a little over a decade. So, how will Bitcoin fare out? Join me in a future video and you will learn more about it.